The Renegade Daleks were a powerful faction of Daleks that opposed Davros' self-proclaimed right to rule the Daleks' destiny, and were instead loyal to the incumbent Supreme Dalek who Davros had ousted in order to set himself up as Dalek Emperor. Despite being made up of Daleks who had originally formed the main Dalek Empire, these Daleks were given the name Renegades by Davros, who established a new faction of Imperial Daleks and pushed the Renegades off Skaro, igniting a civil war within the Dalek Empire. The war between the Renegades and the Imperials was waged for more than just political reasons, however. The Renegade Daleks considered the Imperial Daleks to be impure, due to the fact that Davros had modified their design and incorporated various bionic implants that altered the physiology of the mutant creature, something that the original Daleks found unacceptable. As such, the Imperial-Renegade Dalek Civil War became a bitter and violent war for racial supremacy, with each faction believing itself to be the true Dalek faction and considering the other to be unworthy of the name Dalek. Renegade Daleks were characterised by their grey and black casings, which were physically similar to the grey Dalek warriors of the previous Dalek regime, from before and during the Mavellan War, whereas the Imperial Daleks and their prototypes were designed by Davros to deliberately contrast the colours of the Renegades, using a regal white and gold design. Before the outbreak of the Imperial-Renegade Dalek Civil War, Davros had been freed from his captivity on a human prison station by the Daleks, who wanted his help in curing the Mavellan virus that had splintered their empire, but he soon came into conflict with the Supreme Dalek and brainwashed several Grey Dalek units to obey him, causing infighting within the Dalek ranks. Davros spent many years fleeing his creations as the Dalek Empire continued to fragment, and went into hiding and tried several times to establish a new faction to rival the forces of the Supreme, eventually succeeding after several false starts and founding his Imperial faction, which began a war against the main Dalek Empire and eventually went on to push the original Daleks off Skaro. Due to the effects of the Mavellan virus and the fragmentation of the Dalek Empire following the Mavellan War, many other Dalek factions had come to exist that spread out across the universe, and when the Supreme Dalek was pushed off Skaro by the Imperials, it began rallying several of these factions to its cause. Some of these factions supported the Supreme in theory but did not actually come into direct confrontation with the Imperials, while other factions abandoned their independence and were assimilated into the ranks of the Renegade faction. As such, there are examples of Renegade Daleks with slightly different casing designs, but almost all of them conform to the standard grey livery that characterised this faction. The most elite Renegade Daleks, known as the Veteran Campaigners, acted as an elite guard of shock troopers for the Supreme Dalek. These Renegade units, being veterans of previous Dalek conflicts such as the Mavellan War, were among the most battle-hardened Daleks to exist at this point in their timeline, and could easily hold their own against the Imperial Daleks even when significantly outnumbered. The Imperial Daleks had been enhanced by Davros' alterations to their design, but this paled in comparison to the Renegades' raw combat experience, which the comparatively young Imperial Dalek faction lacked. Davros himself was aware of this, and sanctioned the use of at least one special weapons Dalek to counter the Renegade Daleks' advantage. Some sources indicate that in the early days of the war, the Renegades also had their own special weapons Daleks, and that the Imperial version of this unit was in fact a former Renegade Dalek that had either defected to the Imperials or was captured and altered by Davros to obey his commands, but this is unconfirmed. Either way, despite the Renegades' experience, they quickly began to lose the war. Initially, the Renegades had held the upper hand, with the burgeoning Imperial faction very much on the back foot in the conflict, with certain sources suggesting that the Renegades were able to maintain a force on Skaro to hamper the Imperials' progress. However, the Imperials' sheer numbers, compounded by the limited reinforcements the Renegades could field, pushed the Renegades back and eventually forced them to adopt strategies from their enemies. Although initially bold in their direct assaults, by the end of the war the Renegades were resorting to clandestine tactics that the Imperials had pioneered, essentially fighting a guerrilla war across time and space. Using their compact time controller device, the Renegades could take small task forces to different points in time, but as their numbers dwindled, they were unable to meet the Imperial Daleks in direct confrontation as they had done in the past. Instead, the Supreme Dalek looked for any advantage it could to try to tip the balance of the war in favour of the Renegade faction. This eventually led the Renegades to seek out the Time Lord Stellar Manipulator, the Hand of Omega, which the Doctor had hidden on Earth in 1963. Since the Imperials were also searching for this device, both factions established operations in Shoreditch, near where the hand was hidden, and began scouring the area in secret for the superweapon, assuming that whichever faction secured it would have the means to win the war. The Renegades established a base in an old warehouse, and kidnapped a child from Cold Hill School to enslave to their battle computer, giving it an imaginative edge which they hoped would counter Davros' ingenuity. Through the battle computer, they established relations with a local fascist group and used them to search for the Hand of Omega, while the majority of their units remained in a low power state in the warehouse. One unit, which had been tracking a local time anomaly, also hid in Totters Lane Junkyard, and was activated when military forces began poking around in the area. This Renegade unit emerged and engaged the military, but was destroyed by the 7th Doctor using Ace's Nitro 9 explosives. Once their slaves had located and recovered the Hand of Omega, the Supreme Dalek and his forces awoke, exterminated their unwitting workers, and deployed troops to patrol the area while their time controller device powered up. The Renegades initially held their own against the Imperials despite being outnumbered, as they were able to deploy jamming devices that interfered with the Imperials' targeting systems and made use of choke points in the local area, which the Imperials were unfamiliar with, to hold the line against their enemy. The Imperials' use of the Special Weapons Dalek, however, quickly overwhelmed the Renegade Dalek forces, who were also caught up in conflicts with the local military, forcing the Supreme Dalek to recall all of its units to protect the Hand of Omega and await their departure once the time controller device was powered up. Unfortunately for the Renegades, the Doctor sabotaged the time controller device, delaying the Supreme Dalek's escape and giving the Imperial Daleks time to locate their base and recover the Hand. After its elite guard were obliterated by the Imperial Special Weapons Dalek, the Renegade Dalek Supreme went into hiding, as it was quickly beginning to realise that its link with the battle computer exposed it to a critical weakness. It was vulnerable due to the emotions of the child who they had wired up to their central node, causing it to become sluggish and confused. Despite the apparent victory of the Imperial Daleks, the entire skirmish turned out to be part of an elaborate plan set up by the Doctor, and Davros was tricked into activating the Hand, which had been pre-programmed to enter Skaro's native time zone and send its sun supernova, ravaging the planet before feeding back and destroying the Dalek mothership, wiping out the vast majority of the Imperial Daleks. Although technically victorious, the Renegade Dalek Supreme would later be destroyed by the Doctor, who manipulated its heightened emotions and persuaded it that it was trapped, isolated, and without any hope of reinforcements. This influx of emotions caused the Renegade Dalek Supreme to suffer a catastrophic impairment, destroying the Renegade Dalek leader. Even with the complete loss of their forces at Shoreditch, technically the Renegade Daleks won the Dalek Civil War. Unlike the Imperials, whose capital and primary battleship had been obliterated in the Gambit, the Renegades had devoted only a small number of their forces to the Shoreditch skirmish, and they had many other non-participatory sub-factions whose indifference to the war ended up ensuring their survival. Due to the loss of the Supreme Dalek, the remaining Renegade Dalek forces scattered across the galaxy once again fragmented, but many of these later recoalesced into a new Dalek regime which, despite the existence of other post-Imperial Dalek factions created by Davros or other high-ranking Imperial survivors like the Restoration Emperor, essentially went on to become the next incarnation of the primary Dalek Empire, which would go on to have many more encounters with the 7th and 8th Doctors. However, some sources suggested that the Imperial Dalek faction continued in some form or another. Once the remains of the Renegade Dalek faction had reclaimed the ruins of Skaro, the Dalek Prime allegedly waged a campaign of genocide against what remained of the Imperial Daleks, implying that there were still many Imperial Dalek remnants scattered across the universe. There was also the previously mentioned Restoration Emperor and the post-Imperial Dalek factions created by Davros. Regardless, or perhaps as a result of the infighting, the Emperor Dalek, be he the Dalek Prime or the Restoration Emperor, eventually reformatted the Dalek hierarchy and replaced the standard grey or white Daleks with bronze Daleks, sweeping away the last vestiges of the Renegade and Imperial Dalek factions and establishing a new order that would eventually go on to wage war against the Time Lords in the last Great Time War. For most residents of the universe, even Dalek historians and time-sensitive races like the Time Lords, the eventual outcome of the Imperial-Renegade Dalek Civil War was shrouded in mystery, and at some point between the 47th and 51st centuries, the Dalek Empire vanished from the universe entirely as far as humanity and its allies were concerned, leading many to assume that the Imperial-Renegade Dalek Civil War, or another conflict like it, had brought about the end of the Dalek Empire. However, at least one Dalek donning a Renegade Dalek casing survived into the post-Time War period, and formed part of Dalek control on the rebuilt planet Skaro. What do you think of the Renegade Dalek faction? What's your favourite Dalek story in which these stalwart grey warriors appear? Who do you think ruled the Renegade Daleks, the Supreme Dalek or the Dalek Prime? And most crucial of all, which Dalek faction do you think actually won the Civil War? Did the Renegades eventually reclaim Skaro, or were they eventually superseded by the Imperial Daleks via the Restoration Empire? Or do you think neither faction won, and the subsequent Dalek Empires are the result of other factions sweeping in to take advantage of the power vacuum following the disastrous Hand of Omega incident? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.
Don't forget to click below to subscribe to
Dalek Bumps.